Welcome, everybody. This is the Esri's story map workshop dealing with your introduction to story maps, as well as including three presentations from storytellers from the Smithsonian. This is open to anyone from museums, gardens, and zoos elsewhere as well, so we're expecting quite a few participants. Anyway, I'm going to hand it over to Alan Carroll now. He's the head of the StoryMaps team at Esri, and
Dan, we just lost you, but I think you've pretty much finished your introduction anyway. Good afternoon, everybody. It's great to have you here. It looks like there are about almost 180 people, which is really exciting. Probably most of them from Smithsonian, but hopefully some from others from museums, aquaria, et cetera, across the country and maybe the world. I founded the StoryMaps team at Esri about 10 years ago. And by the way, my wife has worked at the Center for Folk Life and Cultural Heritage at the Smithsonian for something like 35 years. So I feel very at home today. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and jump right into things. Just a second. Are you seeing what's the story map?
Yes, we can see it, Alan.
Great. Okay, just want to make sure. What's a story map? So story maps work on the web, of course, and they combine interactive maps, that is, maps that are created often, but also hosted on Esri's cloud resource, ArcGIS Online, with multimedia content. So your photos and videos and audio and text, of course, to tell stories about the world. And the world, I truly mean the world. So every topic under the sun, every scale from neighborhood all the way up to planet-wide. They work on a variety of screen sizes. So in other words, they're responsive and work just as well on mobile devices and tablets as they do on PCs. It's best to author story maps on big screens, but they work on all sorts of screen sizes. And then to me, the big secret of story maps is that they incorporate interactive builders. So you don't need to know any kind of coding or HTML or CSS, anything like that. You use a block palette, which we'll show you a little bit later on in this session, to essentially create building blocks and create, add, and arrange and rearrange building blocks to put together a beautiful multimedia story. Esri hosts your story maps in that same cloud service, ArcGIS Online. We don't claim any kind of ownership. It's simply a place for that content to be hosted and made accessible via all sorts of means. Some of you might be familiar with what we now call our classic apps. We started about 8 or 9 years ago creating what became a series of separate web apps, each of which presented a different way of combining maps and multimedia content. But about 3 or 4 years ago, we decided we needed to go to the next level. And so we created ArcGIS StoryMaps that has many advantages. Among them is that within this single builder now, you can find user experiences that are very similar to, in some ways, better than and different than the classic stories. So we urge you to try and work with ArcGIS StoryMaps. We've had a very exciting run over the last decade. It's been a real thrill to see story maps just take off. We're now actually starting to approach 1.5 million stories. I think we're above 1.4 million stories hosted on ArcGIS Online, plus tens to perhaps hundreds of thousands more that we can't count that are behind firewalls or within enterprise systems. Many different organizations are using story maps, among them some of the largest conservation and humanitarian organizations. Federal agencies are using story maps very broadly, especially EPA and NOAA, each of which has several hundred story maps. National Park Service, USGS, other federal agencies, international NGOs, and of course, Smithsonian Institution to an increasing extent, and you'll get to see a couple of examples of that. Also, my alma mater, National Geographic, is using some story maps. I was at Nat Geo for 27 years before I came over to Esri. Another thing that's been really exciting to us that's happened more or less organically is that they've really taken off in the education space, and that teachers are assigning students story maps as an alternative, and we think a more engaging alternative to traditional research papers. And so now the number of student produced story maps is outstripping all the others combined, at least by one count recently. We'll talk more about where to go for information, but the basic starting point is esri.com/storymaps. But before I move on, I'm going to give a little bit of advice about storytelling. So it's one thing to learn the builder, but it's quite another thing, of course, to become adept at storytelling itself. Like any creative medium, story maps can be used clumsily or can be used elegantly. And given our experience over the years in storytelling with maps, and the fact that we've observed hundreds of stories that have been produced by our growing user community, these are a few bits of advice that we think you'll find useful. So maybe step zero, which I don't don't mention here, is that the first things you should think about, of course, are what's the story you're going to tell? What's the main point you want to get across? And who is your main audience? So those are really the basic things upon which you start to conceptualize and build a story. But once you've done that, rather than just hastily throwing together a story, it's good to think about these few items. Of course, I could come up with 90 steps to great storytelling, but these are a few of the ones that we think might be most useful and important. So first is to start with a bang. Try to come up with an evocative title and a beautiful opening image, and hopefully those can work off one another. Sometimes a story can start with no image at all, but we like this idea of an alluring image or a looping video like this one. So this could have been just something like making sure our skies stayed dark at night, but the stewards of the night with this beautiful video clip just resonates, I think, with readers, and is a more attractive way to lure them into a story. Here's another example. In Search of Refuge, with this beautiful photograph of refugees marching across looks like a levee or something, but at any rate, again, rather than just a label, it's got an active verb, which we like to use, not all the time, but when appropriate, and a nice pairing of word and image. Second is to add a hero. And by that, I mean a couple of things. One is that people love people. And if you can populate your story with real people, you're more likely to engage readers. You can feature a single person or a group of people, a community, maybe even a non-human hero, but I'll get to that in a second. So a wonderful example of a peopled story map is this one by the Grand Canyon Trust called Voices of Grand Canyon, where they interviewed and featured several people from American Indian tribes in the area of the Grand Canyon. And so those people talk about how the importance of the canyon to their cultures. And it's a very fresh and moving way of looking at a very familiar landmark. I'm a longtime bird watcher, so I have a weakness for stories about birds, but this one and a sister story about another shorebird were particularly effective in that they follow the journey of a sandpiper, this tiny little bird that flies, among other things, for 4 days and 4 nights nonstop from, I believe, the coast of New Jersey down to the northern coast of South America. And they feature the miraculous flight of and life history of this bird, but then it's really just a technique in order to identify stopover points along that bird's migration route and the conservation efforts that are underway to protect those key stopover points. Third trick is to think about and to give your story rhythm. So the idea here is, and it doesn't necessarily apply to every story, but often a story will involve a series of locations or a series of related phenomena. And often I find myself working to take advantage of that and provide a sort of repeating structure, which people can quickly become familiar with and becomes a sort of comforting regular rhythm to a story that I think can increase its accessibility. So a story I worked on religious sites and pilgrimages lend itself well to that. So each section about each of the world's 5 major religions starts with a, we hope, an attractive image, then goes on to a large format, kind of vertically oriented map that sort of evokes, the map itself kind of evokes a pilgrimage, and then on to more detailed an essay that's illustrated with additional photographs. So we did that again for each of the 5 major religions, and I think it made for a successful narrative. Here's another example about wealth divides. So we just took a relatively simple concept, but we took a nationwide map of median income, household median income, and pointed out in a half dozen or so US cities, how within a mile or so, less than a mile, sometimes just a few blocks, like here, the Upper East Side of New York, you can go from very high, some of the highest median household income levels to levels that are below the poverty line. It's something that we're all familiar with, but to see that pattern repeated across cities and to see it so starkly portrayed in maps is perhaps a way to drive home our continuing and a worsening problem with income inequality. Next is to create a little world, and by that I mean to try to, both in terms of the editorial style, but especially in terms of design elements, to try to kind of tie your story together. So it's kind of easy to take a graph and make a picture of it and throw it into a story, but it takes a little extra work, but work that we think is worthwhile, to then restyle that graph to match the look and feel of your story, the graph and other elements, to create a really unified effect. And that way, all these disparate elements, photos, videos, static maps, dynamic maps, animations, etc., all start to feel like part of a whole. Sometimes that means you can really, often I think it involves simplification. So here's a story that looks simple, but it's obviously been very carefully thought out, about Menhaden. And the authors decided to make everything black and white except for these kind of red accent markings, and to give it a kind of informal handwritten style. And the result is just a really beautifully unified and really attractive narrative. Our team worked on a story called The Two Koreas. This was back when Korea was in the headlines and things were kind of heating up there, and we decided to give a kind of historical context. So for this story, we came up with red, obviously representing North Korea, a sort of blue-gray representing South Korea. And we used that theme to and ran it through the whole story, not just in terms of maps, but also infographics. And we also used a kind of split screen effect so that we juxtaposed North Korean images and graphics on the left and South on the right. So again, the result is a really seamless kind of elegance that we thought was pretty successful. This is now made a lot easier with ArcGIS StoryMaps, and even since I did this story, we've added a significant enhancement. So within a so-called design panel, which you'll see again later in this session, you can choose among 6 pre-cooked themes. So with a single click, you can change the font pairings, the background color, accent color, and other graphic elements like quote blocks, etc., so that it kind of automatically gives your story this kind of graphic unity. But we have a new feature that allows you to further customize and create your own themes, create and save your own themes, which you can then apply to your own stories. So again, this can be used to help establish a mood, but it can also help with making your story more consistent with your organization's brand. Number 5, one size doesn't fit all. And by that, I simply mean those screen sizes that I talked about a little while ago. So As somebody who used to work as a graphic designer back in the print realm and era, the one thing I could take for granted was the size of the page that I was designing for. But of course, with the web, people are looking at your story on all sorts of screens at different aspect ratios and resolutions. So you need to build your story with that in mind. Our builder has a really elegant preview function so that anytime you're authoring your story, you can see how it's going to look on mobile devices and tablets as well as large screens. And we urge you to use that regularly and to think about how your media is going to work, how your whole narrative is going to work in those different sorts of contexts. By the way, StoryMaps, we work very hard to kind of optimize our media for those different screens so that, say, on a small cell phone, you're not wasting time loading a very large image. We automatically kind of size down and send out the images that are appropriate to the device that a reader is using. This is a different way of thinking big and thinking small, or thinking large or tiny. The idea here is, instead of physical size, is to think about macrocosm and microcosm. This is using one of our classic apps, but it's a story that our team worked on a few years ago called The Cost of Beef, obviously. And the idea was to help point out to people that beef is might be delicious, but it's also quite expensive in terms of environmental cost. So we worked with a group at the University of Minnesota called Institute on the Environment, which had published a series of really good maps showing worldwide distribution of beef. I'm going to show you this really quickly because I think we have time. So here's the macro look. So we're looking at global patterns of beef consumption and production, but then that's informative and interesting. And of course, we see how the United States is a world leader in this perhaps slightly dubious area. But to bring it to life, we come right down to the local level. So here's a herd of cattle around a watering station. We go to feedlots and see these enormous areas where beef are being fattened for the slaughter with their kind of open cesspools of excrement. You can only imagine what that smells like. And then go to Dodge City, Kansas, which is historically a beef center. See that it's huge feedlot there. Zoom in on the feedlot to see more lagoons, but also zoom in on, this is essentially a slaughterhouse. And you can see the industrial scale of this beef operation. It kind of drives home and sort of unifies the idea of this faraway look and a more close kind of examination. Moving on to number 7, use active and passive maps. A dirty little secret is that you can publish story maps with no maps at all, but we love maps and hope you will use them. And there are lots of forms, of course, maps can take. We all kind of assume, at least on our team, we start by assuming maps are going to be interactive. But we also really like, and increasingly like, static maps, because we realize that despite the ability to interact with maps, it's not always needed or appropriate, and that people panning and clicking and zooming can be kind of a distraction, and a lot of people don't bother to. So don't forget static maps as a great storytelling device, because you're able to give your readers exactly the information you want them to have without fear of their becoming distracted. ArcGIS StoryMaps now has a beautiful way of creating simple maps called Express Maps that we're going to demo later in this session, I believe, at least briefly. Number 8 might be obvious, but not necessarily to everybody. So to keep it short and sweet. So the web is not a medium that people like to sit for hours and read long form text for the most part. Stories, we've seen stories that get awfully long, and perhaps people who really, really love Glen Canyon will be willing to go through the 100 essentially chapters of this story, but we think that's probably excessive. And so when we it's sometimes on the opposite direction, which is to take spaceports and just choose 7 of them around the world, even though there are quite a few more these days. And then finally, we feel it's really important to make a call to action. So every story ought to end up with something to do, whether it's just a link to more information, or better yet, like this story from Protect Our Winters, providing an array of things you can do, from writing your congressperson to contacting the organization, to donating, to volunteering, etc. So with that quick tour of a few pointers, I'm going to turn it over to Liz, who's my colleague and a very special multimedia specialist on our team. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Alan. Okay, I'm gonna go ahead and share my screen. And I'm gonna give you a demo into ArcGIS StoryMaps and our builder. And the first thing I'm going to do, as Alan mentioned, is go to esri.com/storymaps. And when this loads, it will take us into our product homepage. So here you can find a high-level overview of what ArcGIS StoryMaps is. You can also go to this little Explore Stories tab and see what stories we're reading. And this is a curated gallery of information that changes every week, and the team contributes to it. You can also go to this Resources tab, which is my absolute favorite part of this page, because it has incredible different stories and tips about storytelling best practices, transferring over from classics to ArcGIS StoryMaps, how to start your story, and it also has a pretty robust overview of what's new with ArcGIS StoryMaps, so everything we've updated in the last release, and also has blogs and any sort of webinar presentations that the team has been doing thus far. And now I'm going to go ahead and launch the builder, and I'm going to do so by going over and clicking this blue button in the upper right-hand corner that says Launch ArcGIS StoryMaps. And as you can see, it's plopped me right into my stories homepage. It did that because I'm already logged in. And so if you're not logged in already, it will prompt you to log in, and then it will bring you to a general page where you kind of see all of the different stories that you have published or that you're working on. As you can see, I have quite a few different stories, definitely a lot of demo stories, and they're all in different forms. So this story over here titled Ice is in draft format, which means I haven't published it and everything is completely unpublished and I can change everything on the back end. This story that says Introduction to Storytelling is published, and that's indicated by this turquoise card up in the right-hand corner. And that means that anything I do in the builder with this story, I'll have to republish it again because it's already open to the public on whatever sharing setting I've already designated. And then my third card here says Unpublished Changes, which is one of my favorite newer features we have, which means that all features that or changes that I make in the back end of a story will be saved until I choose to make it public. And that's really great if you have a story that you need to consistently update and keep evergreen. But for this part of the demo, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to create a new story. And I'm going to do that by clicking this button. When I click the button, it offers me a few different options. I can start from scratch, or I can use one of our quick start templates. And these quick start templates will provide you kind of a pre-baked option with one of our immersive blocks already in it. And it's just a really nice way to jumpstart your storytelling process. But for now, I'm going to go ahead and start from scratch. And now we're launched into the builder, right? And so as you can see, I'm immediately prompted to make a hopefully engaging title, but for right now, I'm just going to have to go for demo, which is definitely not the greatest. You'll want to be more creative with yours. And I'm going to go ahead and add a cover image. And so I went ahead and created a folder of different demo imagery, and I'm going to go ahead and choose this photo of ice that I absolutely love. And as you can see, when it loads, I can have a nice iceberg for my cover, but it's not really showing most of the iceberg. So maybe I want to move down the focal point of this image, or since I'm still not really happy with that, I can click on design at the upper right-hand side of my corner, or the sidebar at the top, and I can choose either side by side or an immersive cover, which I really love. And I can move my text up and down, but in this case, I want it up in the sky so it's not blocking the placement of my iceberg. And I can go back into my design panel and I can change the theme if I want. And so the theme changes the color or the text, the accent colors as well. And we have these three different these 6 different custom pre-baked options that are optimized for accessibility, for visual accessibility. Or I can go into a new option, which we released in September, called Theme Builder, by clicking Manage and build my own custom theme. And so when I do that, we are launched into another window, and you can see different themes that I have. Right now, we're going to take a look at this Antarctica theme that fits really nicely with my iceberg photo. And I can go over here and see, what my story header, in this case, it's going to be white. Any kind of accent colors that I've designated. In this case, I went in and I picked different hex codes from pictures of ice that I had, so that they all accent each other well, but provide enough contrast to be visually accessible. I can look at the text that I'm using here. Right now, I'm just using one straight text all the way through. But some people like to mix and match different text formats. A quick note in terms of accessibility, sans serif fonts are generally more visually accessible than serif fonts, but it's truly up to you. I can change the button, so what the button looks like if I want it round or just having a little more rounded edges. I can take a look at quote styles, right? And I can change how the quotes look. I'm definitely a fan of this one though. And I can also go in and change my separators to make them look different. And then the last thing I would do if I was making this for, a real story, I would go ahead and upload a logo. So you'd want to have your organization's logo here, and it would pop up in the upper left hand of your header. But for now, I'm just going to go back to my demo. I'm going to click Browse Themes, and I'm going to apply Antarctica. And as you can tell, we now have the font that I specified, and we have this nice blue background here. And as we go into the body of the story, I can open up the builder and the block palette in particular, as Alan mentioned, and note that it's broken down into 4 main components. We have the text at the top here, and we have our graphics, which are buttons and separators, our multimedia categories, so that's going to be your images, your videos, your audio, and your maps. And then we have our immersive blocks like slideshow, swipe, sidecar, and map tour. At the moment, I'm actually going to go back into my stories because I've pre-configured a story that'll help us get through this demo a little more quickly today. And so I'm going to go up and I'm going to click Edit Story. We have the same theme, the same cover image, and we're just going to go ahead and get started with ArcGIS StoryMaps. So the first thing I want to walk you through is the different text. So I'm going to type some out. This is text. I know I have a way with words. That's why Alan hired me. I can make it a title heading. I can make it show up as a subheading. I can also make it a bullet or a list. In this case, let's go for a bullet. If I wanted to make this text stand out, I could make it bold or italicize it, or even change the colors for one of those kind of frosty accent colors I told you about in Theme Builder. And then I could add another bullet, or I could go down and start another text thing and say, hey, this is a quote, a beautiful quote, very compelling, and I can go ahead and attach the quote feature to that. And so this kind of pulls the reader's attention to this particular line of text. It also provides some space in my story, and it's a really great visual indicator. The next function I want to talk to you about are the graphics. So like I mentioned, those are going to be your buttons and your separators. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to add a separator, which I've been using already in this story to delineate when I'm starting or stopping a section. And this is just a really nice visual indicator to your reader that you're moving on or transitioning topics. And then I can also add a button. So Alan mentioned there's really cool call to action. So in this case, I've gone ahead and added in a button, and I've typed in learn more. And I can go over to the Smithsonian and say, hey, I want you to learn more, and paste that link in there. And now anybody who clicks the button will be redirected to the Smithsonian's own website. And so hopefully they will indeed learn more there. The next portion of this demo will take a brief look at multimedia. So I mentioned this is kind of this middle palette in the block palette. And so I'm going to go ahead and add an image. I'm of the opinion that most ice is definitely not complete without penguins. So I'm going to go ahead and add a picture I took of some penguins because who doesn't love penguins? And I have the option of making this medium-sized or larger, and I can even make it fall in line to the left of my text, which is great if I don't want my image to dominate anything. But in this case, I think I want it small and just to kind of fall in line with the main body of the story. And I think it would also be super helpful if I added in some audio, because I don't know how many people have had the option to hear penguins, but penguins are pretty loud. And so I'm going to go ahead and add some penguin noises here. And while that loads, if we add it, now people get to hear exactly what it sounds like when you're surrounded by penguins. It is an overwhelming experience in literally every meaning of that word. They're very cute, but they're also very loud and I would say kind of smelly, but I won't hold it against them. And so now that we have our image, we have our audio. If I had a video of penguins, I would go in and I would add it the exact same way. But instead, I'm going to go ahead and show you how to add in a map to your story. So to go into the map, I open up the block palette and I click on map. You kind of have three different ways to do so. You can choose from your maps, right? So these are maps that you have in your ArcGIS Online content. In this case, I have a survey map, some maps of iceberg locations going with the theme. I can also take a look at Living Atlas maps, which is going to be full of authoritative data sources. So I could search icebergs or temperature here, and I have access instantly to thousands of incredible maps that I can use and just put instantly in my story. But in this case, I'm actually going to add an express map, which is one of my favorite things about ArcGIS StoryMaps, and that is the ability to kind of add in information quickly and really, really nicely. So I'm going to go ahead and take a look very close. This is the Antarctic Peninsula, and I'm going to go ahead and drop a point on the map, right? So this is kind of, or this is very close to where Ushuaia is. And so I'm going to go in and add an image of a sea lion that I took there. And, you know, we have feathered friends, so maybe this is a furry friend. And so now we have a point on the map, which was the start of my journey. I'm going to go in and I can add a line. And so I want to start near the end of South America and maybe go over to somewhere on the Antarctic Peninsula. You know, I didn't go through that island, so I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to maybe curve the line. I don't know if that was the exact trip path we took, but it's close enough. And then I want people to know that this was indeed a journey. So this is our path. I cannot spell today, but it's a Monday, so we'll blame it on that. And we'll go ahead and make sure everybody knows that this was the path we took. And in a few quick sentences and seconds, we have an express map ready to be added to the map. It's not the prettiest, but you get the idea. It's really quick, beautiful cartography. And for all of my cartography nerds out there, you can even add arrows to your express map. And in our desktop softwares, that definitely takes more than a few seconds. So I really appreciate this feature. The next thing I can add in the multimedia section are embeds, so I can embed different information. So I have this site of Antarctic base map layers. I'm going to go ahead and click embed. And when you embed web content, you have the option of doing it one or two ways. You can create an iframe code, which allows you to customize different parameters, so specify the width and the height and different rules, or you can just paste the URL in directly, which is what I'm going to go ahead and do. So I'm going to go in and add that base map site. And as you can see, it pops up in this really nice card. When you embed something, you can either embed it in a card view or an interactive view. And so I can change this around and see what I want. I think it's a little overwhelming to have this in interactive view, so I'm going to move it back to card view. And we're going to go ahead and jump into the special blocks now. And so these are your immersive blocks, your slideshow, your swipe, your sidecar, and map tour. So the first block we're going to take a look at is slideshow. And slideshow offers a really nice immersive experience. You can add images or videos or maps, and it's really media focused. So I'm going to go ahead and add in, actually, I'm not going to add in that picture. I'm going to add in a picture of a very large iceberg that I saw on my trip. And I already know that I don't like where this slide title is paneled, so I'm going to drop it down, and maybe I'll drop it down some more. And I can say, you know, this is ice, and I don't love the color of the panel, so I'm going to make it transparent. The next thing I'm going to go ahead and do is I'm going to add another slide to this. And so we're going to add another image. And, I want people to know that Antarctica isn't just ice and penguins, although they're important parts of the area. It's not just everything. So here is a picture of a snowy mountain, and I could add some more information saying, this is a mountain. And I don't love that placement, so I'm going to go ahead and move it all the way over to the right-hand side. And now my reader can go ahead and scroll through this horizontal or vertically. And this does a really great job of breaking up scroll fatigue. So if your reader's moving through something moving through a lot of information vertically, adding in a slideshow allows them to interact with something horizontally, and it's really great. The next feature I want to talk to you about is swipe. And so swipe is one of my favorite options. You can add in images or you can add in web maps. In this case, I'm going to go ahead and add in a picture of ice again, but I also have an image of it in black and white. And I'm going to use swipe to show the difference between the image in black and white and color. But swipe is generally really great for showing changes over time or looking at before and after photos. And it's one of my favorite really interactive features, because who doesn't love to just kind of toggle back and forth and look at differences? The next immersive block we're going to talk about is Map Tour. And so Map Tour offers you two different options. You have your guided tour, which readers can move through a set of points that you specify in sequential orders, or Explorer Tour, which allows readers to interact with points at their leisure. Guided tour is really great if you want to take people on a specific journey, but Explorer Tour is incredible for larger data sets where your reader might get a little tired just endlessly kind of clicking through different points on a map, and instead has the option to move through it as they would as they did on their own free time. And then it prompts me to choose, do I want a map focused or media focused? Again, I tend to think that I have some pretty good pictures, so I'm going to choose media focused. And now I have a media focused guided tour on the map. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to move over towards when my map loads. We're going to go back to the Antarctic Peninsula, and I'm going to drop a point somewhere here and turn on a custom zoom level so that it stays, and add this location to the map. I'm going to go ahead and add an image, and I have this image of a photographer taking actually, I guess it's a videographer here, taking a video of a penguin colony. So I'm going to go in and add that, and I could add in, some text, right? So this is a video, although this is actually a picture. And then I can go ahead and I can add another point on the map. And so when I add this location, I'm going to, instead of just dropping a point, I'm going to search for something, and I'm actually going to look up Lockroy. And Lockroy, Antarctica, it's Port Lockroy, and it's actually the southernmost post office. I'm going to turn on my custom zoom level again and add this location to the map. And when I was at Port Lockroy, I had a really great opportunity to see a baby penguin. So I'm going to add in another feature, an image, and say this is a baby penguin. And when it loads, my reader will be jumped back and forth between points on this map. So from the tip of the Antarctic Peninsula down to Lockroy, and see different media as we go. The last thing I want to move you through is Sidecar, and Sidecar is one of my favorite options as well. Basically, they're all my favorite. I absolutely love working with ArcGIS StoryMaps, but Sidecar is great for kind of expanding on your narrative in really complex ways. So you can have a floating panel that's more immersive, and it's great for different maps, or you can have a docked panel, which is incredible if you want to add in additional infographics and a lot of text. I'm going to choose a docked panel, and we're going to add some text here. This is more text. And then I'm actually going to go ahead and I'm going to add in a map, and I'm going to take a look at historic iceberg locations, if this will load. But the thing with Sidecar is while you have your media, I guess my scene isn't going to load today, but so we won't actually add a map, but I can add in media or a map, and in this case I can add in another image. But it is, I haven't really talked about whales. There's a lot of whales in Antarctica, so we'll add in an image of whales. But say I wanted to talk about whales on the right with this image, I could also add in another complementary image on the left, or any other graphic talking about different whale populations there. But for now, I'm actually going to scroll down to the end because I know I have to hand this over to Ross and, well, actually to Alan and Dan. And so the last thing I want to remind you is always make sure you're adding in attribution at the end of your story. So in this case, I didn't record penguins while I was there, but I did take all of the photos that were used in this demo. And so I credited myself for a penguin picture, but I also added in the proper attribution for the audio. And I'm going to give a huge thank you to Ellen and also to Ross, who will give another demo later, and to our incredible Smithsonian storytellers. And with that, I will hand it over to Alan and Dan to introduce our next speakers.
Dan, why don't you take it away?
Okay, our first speaker will be Kayleigh Walters, who's the Living Collections Manager for Smithsonian Gardens. And she's going to be showing several stories and discuss her experience using story maps for the gardens. So go to it, Kayleigh.
Thanks, Dan. And my boss is actually the manager. I'm the cataloger of Living Collections. So my name is Kayleigh. I work at Smithsonian Gardens, and I took my first course in how to use story maps in January and published my first one in mid-March. So you can pretty quickly get started with story maps. In my first story map I worked on, well, actually, let me take you through the thought process behind what I do when I'm making a story map. Don't need that up right now, because I find that's often the hardest place to get started. So I have some beautiful slides for you. My first question I ask myself is, what do I want to say? So basically, what is the core, most basic idea of what I want to say in my story? And I can expand out from there later, get more complicated. And after that, who do I want to say it to? Who's my audience? And then what do I need? And this is the very exciting part where we get to make outlines, which is more exciting when they're being used for practical purposes than when you're making an essay in middle school. So for my first story map, the cherry blossoms of Smithsonian Gardens was actually my most popular one as well, which was surprising because it was my very first test of how to use this. So my thought process in this one was, what do I want to say? Basically that cherry blossoms are very beautiful, that Smithsonian Gardens has several types of cherry blossom trees, and also give people a relaxing atmosphere, because that's always been part of the enjoyment of cherry blossoms. And then I thought, who is my audience? People who enjoy cherry blossoms. And what do I need? I need images of the flowering trees, and then the flowers themselves, some text, a quick map, or maps rather, and some imagery. So I started just by writing some flowery text, no pun intended, about the history of cherry blossoms. I found some images from the Freer collection, and then put a beautiful large cherry blossom photo in there because people want to see the cherry blossoms pretty quickly. And so I start featuring the trees, and this is actually, okay, we'll go with that. There'll be an image of the full tree overall on this side, and then let me just refresh this. Sometimes when doing things live, there's a bit of a glitch, but that's always fine. So this is a beautiful overall shot of the tree we have from documenting our living collection. I put a close-up of the flower here, and I use sidecar for this, so that I could feature a close-up and a far away, wrote some text. And then we always want to point people back to our site, our living collection site, where each of these trees is documented. So I have a nice button in there that will bring people to our record, and they can explore the rest of our tree collection from there if they like. So I did this for each of our varieties of trees. And when this first came out, it was the beginning of the pandemic, unfortunately, so they didn't want us to feature maps really heavily in it. But once we reopened, I, at the very end, was able to put our map back in, which I had loaded for you, but now is reloading, which has all of our flowering cherry trees on our campus listed for you. And at the end, I just put a nice flowery border and gave attribution to our photographer. The next story map I'll show you is what I made for when we did reopen. And so what I want to say with this one is basically we're open, which is very exciting. And since this came out in the beginning of July, it's very hot. I also want to remind people that you can go outside and enjoy the gardens, even if it seems like it's sweltering outside. It'll still be enjoyable to be outside. I thought of my audience as the general public, and I knew that I would need beautiful pictures in the summer with good ID for the plants. So for instance, I made sure I got IDs on all these and a few quick maps or express maps. So for this one, I put an express map in here of the walking tour people will be going on so they can have a general idea of what they'd be seeing. And I was able to make this in maybe 15 minutes. So it was very nice to just be able to put that in there. I put in a picture that included a face covering because I want to let people know that was what we'd be doing with the gardens now. And then a lovely bike parked in the gardens. And for this one, I used the content block of a guided tour because I thought it'd be really nice to have this map in the corner, but then a real focus on the beautiful imagery of the garden. And for this one, I actually tested a few different formats to see which would fit best. And I settled on this one, even though you do have to click to the side to see the tree because it just made the tour seem more compact. So it's fine to test a few different options. And I put links in here that, again, link back to all of our tree records. And so this one I'll go through a bit more quickly. And I'll also show you that a nice option is you can include attribution on several photos now. So if you click on this little icon, you can see this photo was taken by this particular person. And then I go to the next one, I can see we have a different photographer here because it's very important for us to give attribution to all of our photographers. You can see lovely roses for this one. And so I've really used the story maps more simply, but still in a way that's very effective as walking tours to guide people through our living collections. And then I just finished this one off with some more imagery at the end. It's quite a long walking tour if you do the whole thing, so it's nice to break it up into sections as well. And I thank people for coming to the gardens, give them some links to our webinars, to our social media, and end it with a nice photo of a hummingbird. And then for my last one that I've done most recently, Fall Foliage of Smithsonian Gardens. It's another walking tour because that works quite well for us. And I thought for this one, what do I want to say? I want to say that we have beautiful fall trees and you should look outside and identify them if you can. Kind of to eliminate plant blindness. Who I want to say this to is the general public who like trees. And then what do I need? I need images of fall trees, some maps, and I really want to feature a map at the end of our like trees, which are deciduous and change color for the fall. So I included some lovely images in this, and I was very excited for this one to get to use the slide feature and feature our American elm at the Natural History Museum, which is the oldest in our collection, going through a summer to fall transition, just because that's beautiful. I put another quick map in here, but just put it to the side, and then just went on another walking tour through the collection. One of the things that I want to show in this, which I really enjoy, since we know a lot of people are going to be looking on this on mobile, you can I need to move this bar. You can preview what all of these are going to look like on different devices, which they showed earlier. So you can see on a mobile how things are going to be laid out. And if I need to like recenter a photo so it appears nicer on a phone, I can do that. Same on a tablet. I can look at how this is all laid out here. I can turn it if I like, in case someone's holding their tablet this way. And then again, go back to a computer. And I just click on Edit Story again to go back into my story. And at the very end of this, as I mentioned, I included a map of our fall trees. My internet's a bit slow here right now, but this is just the life of working from home. And I worked with our arborist to have a view of this map here, which is only of our fall trees, and color code that to the color they're likely to turn for fall, and then include some basic information. You can expand that. If you're on mobile, you can click this here and it'll show you where you are in person if you're doing the walk. And if I have a bit more time, I guess one final thing that I really like is you can come to the corner here of any of your story maps, go to your details, and if you have a like image in your thumbnail that hasn't cropped nicely from the story map, you can edit it, put in any image you like. You can add descriptions to make it easier to find, and you can add in tags. And I would say that is basically the overview of what I have done with story maps here. So now I will pass it over to Deanna if I can get my controls up. So Deanna, take it away.
Hi, I'm Deanna. I'm with Smithsonian's Office of Advancement Communications team as a graphic designer, and we work with all units across Smithsonian, so all the museums and the zoo, creating pieces for fundraising and cultivating donors. So something I just learned today, we're actually going to be working with Kaylee's team, the Smithsonian Gardens, doing a piece for fundraising for their orchids collection in the spring. So that'll be exciting. So our team, we have 3 graphic designers, and we really started using StoryMaps when the pandemic first started back in March. So during this time, we really had to pivot our work and the way that we work and doing a lot more digital pieces that were print previously. So we began exploring different platforms like StoryMaps so that we could engage our audience in a different way than just your traditional PDF or PowerPoint presentation. So something that I would compare it to a lot is Adobe Spark. But like we've seen, I think that StoryMaps has a lot more robust features that are built in there that I found that Adobe Spark doesn't have. So I'm going to share my screen. So this is one of my favorite story maps that I created that I think utilize some of the features that we've seen in the best way. So for this project, our team was tasked to create a birthday present for one of Smithsonian's important patrons, David Rubenstein. So because he's a big history buff, we wanted to write in the voice of James Smithson, the founder of Smithsonian, but not only in the voice of James Smithson, but as if he wrote it himself and as if it came from that time. So this project documents the process that I went through in order to create this piece. So something I really like is this immersive full bleed start, and you can use a video which starts automatically. So for the first part, I use the sidecar feature. And for the first part of my process, I researched James Smithson's letters to see the way that he wrote in order to find a font that looked similar to his writing style. So I really like the transition that the sidecar makes here. So after researching his style of writing, I found a font called Austin that looked very similar to it. And then here I use the sidecar feature, or no, the swipe feature, which I really like to show side-by-side comparisons. So here we have James Smithson's actual handwriting. And then here we have the font that I chose to evoke the same kind of feeling. And then here I wanted to show kind of an example of how I altered the text in order to look more like his handwriting. So in his original handwriting here, you see how expressive the T's are and how exaggerated they are. So in the actual letter, I went into the font and actually pulled those T's so that they're longer and more similar to his actual handwriting. Here we have the before and after of his signature. So the second part of my research, I looked into papers, and we actually spoke with one of our Smithsonian librarians to learn more about 19th century paper. So we learned that they use a lot of linen blend papers. So we spoke with our printers to find a paper that looked a lot like this, where you can see the grain and the lines in the paper. And then for the third part of this process, I learned how to fold the paper in the way that they would. So the letters actually folded into the envelope on a 11 by 17 size paper. And then here's a video that I created to send to our printer to show them how to print or how to fold the piece. Okay, and then in this final part, it's the same video that we saw in the beginning of the presentation that just goes over kind of the finishing touches that I put onto it. So painting the edges so that it looks a little bit more worn in and authentic. Yeah, and then finally, there are just some close-up pictures. And then here's another video of the wax seal process. Yeah. And then that's the final look. And this is how it was presented. So I think that we use story maps in a way that maybe isn't necessarily how it was intended to be used. We haven't really used the full potential of all the map features, but we've really found that our audience and clients have responded to it really well as an alternative to what you would traditionally see for a presentation. So now I'm going to pass it off to Kathy.
Hi, everybody. I am Kathy Carroll. I came to the Smithsonian as an intern at the Smithsonian Anacostia Community Museum, I guess about a year and a half ago through a program in digital public humanities at George Mason University. I am a teacher as well and currently teaching here in Dallas, Texas. And so let me first show you oh goodness. Pardon me, I had everything pulled up. Alan, I'm going to let you, Ross, can I turn this over to you and come back? I am apologizing for my technical difficulties.
That is no problem at all. So I can start sharing my screen. And what we'll do is we'll just move forward into the advanced tips and tricks demo while Kathy gets all set up, and then we'll hand it back over to her. So I'm going to share my screen now. Hopefully everybody can see this. Kathy, can you see this?
Yes, I can. Thank you.
Perfect. Okay, awesome. So I'm going to be building on the great demo that Liz gave us earlier and go a little deeper into some of the specific techniques to extend the functionality of ArcGIS StoryMaps. Now, when I think about ArcGIS StoryMaps, I think about it as a picture frame. You can put any type of content into this picture frame, whether it's photos, whether it's rich multimedia content with videos and audio, or whether it has maps in it. And so what I'm going to show is how to go a little bit deeper. So this is a StoryMaps. This is a story, and I'll be presenting in it. And the first thing we're going to dig into is a technique called map choreography. And map choreography is a really easy technique to implement within your story project. But what it does is it walks your readers through a series of map layers that perhaps would be really overwhelming on first load, but using storytelling techniques, you can walk your readers through that data. So how this works is this is just a sidecar, and I'll break this apart in a minute, but as the reader scrolls, you can see this is a web map of active wildfires. I can zoom in and zoom out on it. As I scroll, I then zoom in on the map automatically. So I am changing the map view by changing the extent of the map. And as you zoom in, you get more detail. So you can see this is Colorado fires. Zoom in one more time and you can get even closer in. And so in doing map choreography, you can create a really immersive reading experience for your audience. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you how to implement this in your own projects. The other thing that I'm going to show is a fun technique where you can actually add background audio within a sidecar section. So here we've got this photo of a firefighter, and behind it I've added some audio. I'm not sure if you can hear that, but what it is it's the sound of fire, a wildfire raging. And so by bringing in these rich audio elements, it will allow your readers to connect deeper with the content of your story and will create a more engaging experience. Okay, so I'm going to show you how I did this. So here we have a sidecar block. And like Liz showed earlier, it's got a series of slides in it. And you can see that it uses the same map, but it's just zooming in a little bit further. So how I did this was I just added a new slide. I clicked Add Media, went to Add Map. And like Liz talked about earlier, there's 3 ways to add maps. These are from my ArcGIS Online account. You've got the ability to create an express map. And you also have access to the Living Atlas layers. Living Atlas is Esri's cloud database that comes from authoritative sources like our Esri teams, like universities, and a variety of other organizations. Now, I'm going to add in this US wildfire activity map. And this should look familiar. This is the one that I had on here before. So I'm going to go to the full extent of the United States. I'm going to place this map in. And so we have a map with a map of wildfire activity. Okay. Now the trick here is to go into these 3 dots at the bottom and click duplicate. What this does is it simply creates a copy of that slide that you had before. Now with this next slide, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to zoom in a little bit on the map. And particularly, I'm interested in Colorado. It's been in the news a lot, and it'll bring the readers into a specific use case. Okay, and just to drive this home, we'll do that one more time. We'll duplicate that slide. It creates a new one. This time, we're going to zoom in even further on this specific event that's currently happening. We'll click Place Map. And here's a specific wildfire. So what we just did was we used sidecar, the sidecar block, to create map choreography to bring our readers into a rich data set showing wildfire activity. Now you can also do this by keeping the same extent of your map, so by not zooming in or zooming out, but just changing the data layers that are visible. So let's duplicate this one more time. We'll go in here and you can see there's all of these amazing rich thematic map layers. And so we can turn these on and off. So for right now, let's just turn on the perimeter layer. Click Place Map. And so this time, what's changing on the map is just the data layer that's present. You can do this one more time. And let's show those hotspots. And place the map. And so by doing this, you can create a really immersive experience for your reader without having to do a bunch of custom coding. I didn't even have to author a new map. I just was able to take Living Atlas layers and bring it into my story. So that's the first advanced tip that I would share. And it's really exciting to see a lot of authors taking advantage of this feature. I think it elevates the storytelling content and adds polish and richness to a story. The next technique is one that we use sparingly, but can be really effective for certain stories. This is adding background audio within a sidecar block so that when there's an image or a video or something else, there's audio playing in the background. Now to enable this, you simply click those 3 dots again and click background audio. Now I've already added in that sound of the fire, but if I were to do this from scratch, all you have to do is go in here, click add background audio, browse to your audio file, click add, and you get this nice message that it's been added. Okay, so, and there's also this indication here, this little note symbol. To just preview what this will look like, we can go into our map choreography section. This is the one that we just created together. And you see this message here. This says unmute background audio. When I do that, the audio starts playing. And when the reader scrolls, it'll turn off. And so in doing so, it's sort of an opt-in experience for readers. Okay, the next thing I want to show you is a really powerful tool called Collections. Now, Collections is a feature within StoryMaps that allows you to take a variety of stories on a related theme and package them up all in one place. This is going to be a good primer for Kathy's presentation because the collection I wanted to show you is actually one that she made. And so I don't want to spoil it, but I'm going to just show you how she packaged up 8 different story maps and had them all in one place as a digital exhibit. I'm going to let her talk more about that, but essentially you can jump to a different story, and in doing so you have this package set of stories all together. Now I'm going to show you how to make one from scratch. Okay, so what I just did was I clicked on this link. This goes to our collections page. Another way to get there is to just click on your profile picture here and click collections. Now this is a little trick because a lot of people don't know that you can click on your profile picture and you get access to go back to your stories page, go to the collections page, go to the themes page, or to sign out or switch accounts. Right now, let's go to the collections page. So you can see it looks very similar to our stories page, but in collections, you can see these are collections that I've put together. To create a new collection, you just click here, new collection. You can create a title, description, click add to collection, and this brings up all the stories that you've created. Now you can also favorite stories, you can find stories that were shared with you, or go into the living atlas again. Right now I'll just select first 6 stories. We'll pretend that they all are related in the same theme. We'll click done. And you can see them, you can open a preview, you can also move and change the order of them. Similar to ArcGIS StoryMaps, you're able to have this design panel where you can change the overall look and feel. You can also add a logo at any time. For right now, I'm going to choose this tabbed layout. And when I click publish, you can see what the story is going to look like. So I'll click get started. And here it comes to my first story, my demo. I can scroll down, go through it. I can also advance to another story, another story, another story. So hopefully this gives you an idea for how you can package up all of your stories into one place. Now, if I want to go back to my stories, simply click on my profile, go back to my demo story. I'll click down here, jump to the collection section. And next, I want to talk about Google Analytics. Now, one of you asked in the chat window, how can I record and get information about who's viewing my stories? Now, we've made it really easy to integrate Google Analytics directly into the builder so that you can track how your story is performing and better understand your audience. So to do this, you're going to go into the Story Settings tab. You get there by clicking these 3 dots. Go to Story Settings. And here you put in your Google Analytics tracking ID. Now, I won't go into Google Analytics too deep, but if you go into your account, go to your admin page, you can get your tracking information really easily and paste it in here. Once you paste it in, you click Save. And within 24 hours, it'll start recording information on how many views your stories received, where they're coming from, whether they're using a desktop or mobile device, and things like that that can be really helpful for better understanding your audience. The next technique I want to show is story duplication. So after I publish my story, you'll get a variety of options here to share out your content, whether it's with a link or social media. But when you're in the builder, you can actually duplicate your story at any time. So say you have a newsletter and you want to create a story that has a similar look and feel every week that you put out the newsletter. You can make one story that sort of becomes your guide or template, and then you just click Duplicate Story. It prompts you to have this question. You click Yes, Duplicate, and it will create a copy within your account. So then you have 2 versions of the same story, and you can modify perhaps the text or some of the visuals from your copy. And in doing so, it'll save you a lot of time. You won't have to redo everything from scratch. There's a lot of other workflows you could think about for when this would be helpful. But again, to get there, you just simply go to those 3 dots and click Duplicate Story. Okay, there's also a question about embedding a story into a website or a Drupal or a Moodle site. So when you make a story public, there's some really easy tools that we've developed so that you can integrate these however you want. So first, when you publish and make it public, your story lives here. It lives on Esri's server, and this is the URL that you can use. Now you can copy that directly here. You can share it on social media really easily. But if you click these 3 dots, you get more actions. And this is where you can do a couple really powerful things. First, you can embed the story. So if, say, you have your Smithsonian website and you want to integrate a story directly into that website, you can copy this iframe code, and your developers could put that into your website and actually have it on smithsonian.com/ whatever story, and you can put in this iframe code. And you have the option to hide the story header and the story cover if you want. And so what that would do is it would hide this here, and it would start right here. This is the header, this is the cover, and this is your story body. Okay, so you can embed it directly if you want. Now, a lot of organizations have figured out different workflows, and it's up to you to figure out what works best for your organization. An organization like NOAA, for instance, they have little images of their story, and when you click on an image, it'll open that story in a new tab. So they've copied the link to a story, and on their website, they've created a nice little image where you can click on it and you can go directly there. So it's up to you to figure out what works best within your for your audience and your goals. Now, there's a couple more actions in here that I want to just touch on. There was a question about printing. There's a simple, print to PDF option. Here, it gives you a little preview. Of course, things like, map choreography or interactive elements, those won't be able to persist within a PDF. But if you have the need for this, you can, export it directly as a PDF just by pressing print. I'll go back to my story and just show you this other cool feature where you can click turn on autoplay. Promise it's working automatically, but this is a great thing for presentations, for exhibit spaces where you have perhaps a big monitor and you want people or patrons who are walking by to be able to look at interesting content on that monitor. And so if you have something like map choreography, this can be a really engaging way for people to take a look at rich storytelling content automatically on one of those displays. Again, I've published this, made it public, and then I turned on autoplay. Okay, let's see. How are we doing on time? How are you doing, Kathy?
I'm doing great.
Okay.
Shall we try again if you'd like?
Yeah. Do you want to take over?
Sure.
Sharing and
yes.
And we can go back to you.
All right. I think you have to unshare first.
Yeah, let me just stop sharing.
There we go.
Perfect.
All right. My apologies, everybody. As I said, I'm a teacher in Dallas. And so I had a bunch of students who were, a Teams meeting was popping up and I clicked too many things to shut out. So anyway, my apologies. So I came to StoryMaps, like I said, from George Mason University, doing an internship at the Smithsonian Anacostia Community Museum. And the task was to develop some educational content for use in the DC public schools. And when I dug down into their curriculum map, it was evident that the exhibit that Dr. Samir Magheli had created was one that was really important in terms of what DCPS students were learning in their senior year in high school. And so my goal was to not only create curriculum, but to create a digital exhibit so that teachers could use it as a pre-visit experience. They could use it as, if they weren't able to get to the museum, that during the run of the exhibit, that they would be able to use it then. And that really that the exhibit should really have a life beyond just the exhibit run, which has been extra important to this exhibit because it was subject to government shutdowns. The museum, and I know you all Smithsonian employees remember that. The museum also underwent some renovation last summer, and then clearly the pandemic has shortened the length of this run. So it's not only given the Anacostia Community Museum a way to share what they were learning during, or share this great exhibit during closures, but it will continue to live on in DCPS curriculum going forward. And I think that that's something that's really powerful. And the story that Dr. Magheli created is really powerful as well. So as Ross mentioned, I did create this using the collections feature. So A Right to the City tells the story of 6 Washington, D.C. neighborhoods and how they responded to urban renewal and gentrification, mostly after World War II. And the neighborhoods were way the physical exhibit was laid out. Most of the content in here, generally speaking, is, you know, from the exhibit guide. And I didn't do a lot of rewriting of the material. I did shorten it some places or rearrange things for it to fit the story map. But you can, again, use the collections feature to walk through these laterally. This was nice in terms of planning for students to use as the curriculum. If you do like a jigsaw method in teaching, it was a way for students to maybe access, you know, each individual neighborhood. But what was really exciting was to be able to pull in the sense of place to these great photos, and being able to use some interesting mapping features that you can use using the Living Atlas. So this is an old National Geographic map that I was able to layer over the present day, and then also able to go in and geolocate a lot of these photos that you'll see as you move through the exhibit. So the ability to use maps really helped to tell the story in a way that it wouldn't have been possible to do otherwise. Another feature that I like is the ability to pull out quotes. So we had these quotations that Dr. McGilly had found. And so really creating a lot of the experience that you would see in the physical space, and then the ability to translate that into a digital environment. If you scroll a little bit further down, they had Ross talking about things that were on the monitors. So the museum had these great oral history snippets, and so these were community voices that were on the Smithsonian YouTube channel that we were able to then just embed using that feature that Ross was talking about. One of the things that I really love about StoryMaps is its stability, and there's been so much that has gone into the design of being able to engineer a really powerful platform that works on multiple devices. So this was us just, you know, taking the exhibit and repurposing it and putting it into a different container that shares this great story of Washington, D.C. neighborhoods. When I mentioned that I'm a teacher, and when we went to virtual learning in the spring, I turned to StoryMaps as a way to curate content or curate lessons for my students. We were in the middle of producing an oral history documentary film, and instead of abandoning that project, students were able to continue that learning. I am continuing to use StoryMaps on a daily basis, and for having students who are physically present with me, and also students who are learning from home at the same time. It is a nice way to keep all of my lesson content in one spot. So this is my story map embedded in a story map. And one of the things that, again, you can embed so many different things. This is actually, I borrowed this idea from the Dallas Museum of Art. It's a jigsaw planet, so I use this as a warm-up activity. So if you're thinking Smithsonian, you know, creators, if you have objects that you can turn into puzzles that a student could use to, you know, promote those skills of close reading. It's something that they work on daily in my class. This is the lesson map that students are using. Today, we're going through and looking at some coins from the time of Julius Caesar. And it just gives me a way to curate the lesson that they need on a daily basis so that they can work through things on their own. You're able to embed things like data visualizations, and then using buttons to put PDFs of images of timelines. And so this is not a super traditional way of using story maps, but it has been one that has been really helpful for me as a teacher. I do also use the story maps in terms of like the founding myths. This is one where I did use that map tour feature to trace the journey of Aeneas throughout the Mediterranean, so that the students, as they're reading this, that they really get a sense of place. One of the things that Ross mentioned in terms of that duplication feature that I really like is that as I've kind of found my flow in writing these and knowing how my students, giving them something to anticipate a daily rhythm to how the lesson is going to go, whether they're at home or in person, or if we have to end up going all virtual at some point this year, that there is that familiarity. And so being able to use these tabs where they can click through to different parts of the lesson are important, and it saves me time because I can duplicate that. I love using story maps. This summer, this is not one that's finished, but we went to Colorado and looked at the original Alpine tunnel that was created in Colorado in the 1800s, and so kind of juxtaposing how the Alpine tunnel of the 1890s differed from the Alpine tunnel or the Eisenhower tunnel that we see today, and just seeing that change over time in the last 100 years. So those are different ways. I've used story maps from curating a museum exhibit digitally to just taking ordinary objects from museum collections that are licensed by Creative Commons to create interesting works for my students. So thank you very much. Ross, should I turn this over to Alan and Dan, I think?
Great. We're actually going to turn it over to Liz, who's going to do a live Q&A. Now, before she gets started, I'm going to open a poll for participants to fill out. So I'm going to launch that poll. And it's just, how are you thinking about using story maps in your work, whether it's presentations, virtual museum? So we'll let that run for a couple of minutes. And while that's going, I'll turn things over to Liz to do a live Q&A. Now, just a reminder, feel free to add any questions that you have to the Q&A window. We've got our panelists here ready to answer questions, whether it's about the product or whether it's about their amazing work. So over to you. Over to you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Ross. And thank you everybody for your incredible engagement and questions. I'll be pulling directly from the Q&A. So like Ross mentioned, if folks have any questions they want to ask the panelists or a member of the StoryMaps team, feel free to drop them in there right now. But for the moment, I'm going to start off with a question for our panelists from the Smithsonian. Would story maps be worth using for something like a walking tour of an individual museum?
Well, I can tackle that. They certainly can. We have not done too many indoor story maps. It presents some mapping challenges. But we're actually planning to take that on as a kind of R&D effort with one of the Smithsonian museums. It's very preliminary, so I don't want to get into details and share information that we either don't have yet or is a little confidential. But there's lots of potential there, and we're excited about exploring that.
Thanks, Alan. I'll also just say that, you know, if you have a really good story and you have the points and you want to jump people around to different parts of an exhibit or different parts of your museum, I say go for it. Our stories are super flexible and very creative, so the sky's really the limit. If you have a thought and an idea, there's no harm in experimenting and trying to figure it out. And we're also more than happy to kind of answer any questions or help you try and figure it out from our end as well. The next question I have is directly for some of the Smithsonian folks. How much usage or traffic have you seen from these different stories, and specifically this cherry blossom story, for instance?
So a really nice feature is I can see the number of views if I go into my story details. For the cherry blossoms map, there's been just shy of 6,000 views. For the fall one, since I released that more recently, that I think it's around 400. And the summer one has had somewhere between 1,000 and 2,000.
Great, thank you so much. Does anybody else want to talk about different view levels they see their stories getting? I think it also really depends on how much you socialize it and what platforms you put it out on. Generally speaking, a lot of stories I know get made and used internally, so they might see less traffic, but they're generally just as valuable.
Yeah, the numbers can vary enormously depending on the topic and the timing and how you publicize a story. Our own team published stories range from quite small, maybe dozens to low hundreds, to hundreds of thousands. We published early in the COVID crisis a story on the coronavirus, and that of course broke all records and got hundreds and hundreds of thousands of views.
Yeah, it's probably most difficult for us after making a story map to just get it out there, because it relies on traffic to our website, traffic to our social media. So it's always a struggle of figuring out how to get it in front of the eyes that we want to see it.
Yeah, those are all great points. So the next question we have is, for these existing Smithsonian stories, are you finding that it's the general public using them, or school groups, or both?
I know that ours has been shared in DC public schools. It's also given it a little bit of a life outside of the Washington, DC area. Many students from Texas go to Washington, DC over spring break. And so I know of a couple of tour groups that actually went to go visit the Anacostia Museum right before it shut down. And so I think it's pulling people into a part of Washington, DC, and some of the lesser known museums that they wouldn't have necessarily gone to or known about otherwise.
And of course, we know that there's a move on within Smithsonian to provide opportunities to virtually visit. Obviously, in the time of the COVID crisis, this is a huge opportunity. But it's an opportunity anytime, because of course not only a minority of the American or international populations can get to Washington, DC. So StoryMaps specifically, but all sorts of other web resources in general, are a great way to vastly expand the audience that Smithsonian reaches.
And I know that, you know, in the time of COVID teachers are really looking for robust resources and content. So that's another thing to think about.
Kathy, have you challenged your students to make their own story maps?
I have. Unfortunately, I teach at a one-to-one iPad school. I shouldn't say unfortunately, but it's a lot harder to build on an iPad. I think we're about to perhaps make some changes or begin to think about that in that regard. And I can't wait, because I will be the first to have them build story maps. But I will say one thing that I think is great in terms of the flexibility for education is that ability to be on a tablet or on a phone, you know, and seeing all the different devices, especially in bring your own technology, bring your own device teaching environments, the ability to have them perform in a stable fashion across all platforms is really a real strength.
Yeah, that's a great point, Kathy. The next question we have is kind of a fun one to think about. So if we've created custom maps for our physical exhibits, can they be added to the kind of thing that Ross is demoing? And so I'm not really 100% sure what part of Ross's demo this was from, but Ross, I'd like to toss this out to you. What do you think?
Woohoo, thanks. So how I interpreted this question was perhaps this was during the map choreography section of my presentation. And so yes, certainly incorporating custom maps that are in exhibits is possible in a variety of ways. So if, for instance, you've made a custom map that has data that's, you know, that you have access to and can share on Google, on ArcGIS Online, then you can do that map choreography directly into a story. Now, if you just have static images, you can also incorporate those directly in, but you'll lose a little bit of that sort of animation of zooming into a specific area. You can replicate some of those features by perhaps taking a, you know, an image that's at the country scale and then cropping into a specific area. And as the reader scrolls, you'll go from this kind of global scale down to a more focused scale. It's a little bit of a different experience, but you can still bring in those custom elements. So that's a quick answer to your excellent question. I also, you know, want to take a second to share the polling results. For those of you who filled that out, 61% said educational materials was how, you know, they'd like to use this. Second was presentations, a virtual museum exhibit is up there, social media content, a virtual newsletter, internal communications. So it's really exciting to think creatively about how these tools perhaps can make things a little bit easier for the workflows that you're doing in your day-to-day work. And again, we're always available. Feel free to reach out if you have questions. Speaking of questions, I'll turn it back over to you, Liz, to bring those back in.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Ross. And it's always great to see the responses to the polls. One of my favorite parts of this job is seeing how you all, the user community, make use of our product, but also just seeing your stories. So I look forward to seeing all of the great stories that are going to happen after this webinar, the things you've been working on. Please don't hesitate to reach out. The next question is one specifically for Kathy. Kathy, with DC public schools having restrictions on certain websites, did you have to work with them to do anything special for them to view it?
I did work with the social studies curriculum coordinator for DCPS just to get his, you know, take on what would be most helpful. But he was willing to, once we created that, to embed it in their curriculum map as a go-to resource. So it wasn't anything that was blocked, but it was actually something that was promoted by DCPS. And so I, you know, encourage you to reach out and get into those curriculum maps and kind of find the places where your content might dovetail with what they're teaching on a particular grade level in a particular subject.
Yeah, that's a really great point and a great question, especially when you're working with educational institutions and also knowing that there are different standards that some things have to meet. It's always helpful to make sure you're communicating directly with educators. Let's see. I guess this is another, we've got a lot of great education-centric questions. Has there been any feedback from teachers who have used it? Do they link it or are they requesting anything in particular? And I think this might be, again, about Kathy's story, or even about some of the other Smithsonian kind of tour stories as well. So I'll just open that up to everyone.
I would love to hear more feedback. We're very happy at any time for people to email us at Smithsonian Gardens, our site, or our email address, and tell us how they've been using it. But we haven't heard too much yet.
Yeah, that's a great point. More feedback's always welcome, right? Let's see, what's next? Diana wants to know, is there a link or a limit to how many links you can include on a map? How many layers can a map include? For example, a photo that links to somebody's website that also includes a YouTube link or social media links. I'll take a quick stab at this and then invite some of my StoryMaps people and Smithsonian featured panelists to jump in on this. But Diana, no, there is not a limit to how many links you can include on a map, but that doesn't mean you should use as many links as possible. You can add links by hyperlinking them to your text. You can add them in buttons and different calls to action. But a really interesting way to add in different links in a map specifically is making a layer that has some really rich information and then using what we call arcade scripts. And I'll drop some links in the chat on specifically what I'm talking about to configure your pop-ups. So you could have somebody click on a point and then link out to maybe 4 or 5 different things without overwhelming your reader with a bunch of different buttons or hyperlinks in text. And Alan, I see you're unmuted, so what else?
It's something we wrestle with. Having links in stories can be useful to people because obviously you're providing access to additional information, but a link can also be essentially an invitation to leave your story. And I think you want to be a little careful with not inviting people to leave too often, and it can be distracting after a while too. So we like links, but we like to choose our links with care and limit the number.
Yeah, that's a great point about inviting folks to leave your story. I think one of the general best practices that I follow when I add links is, if it's to additional information, I can generally hyperlink it in the text. But if I want to make sure that my audience sees it's an additional resource that I really want them to go to, I add it at the end. It's always nice to have a robust call to action section or additional information. And you can make use of strategic placement to keep people in your story for longer.
And by the way, don't be afraid that people are going to that nobody's going to get to the end of your story. We haven't done as much research on this lately as I'd like, but we have done some research on how sticky stories are, and story maps are incredibly sticky. So a little study we did a couple of years ago, maybe 3 years ago now, compared, I guess the average time people spend on a typical web page is about 30 seconds. But for our team produced stories, the average time was something like 6 minutes and 45 seconds, which is an eternity in internet time. So stories are engaging. Stories really get people excited. They literally change people's minds because our brains secrete this chemical called oxytocin, which increases our empathy. This is in response to character-driven stories. So stories that might put a donate button at the end, because that button is at the end doesn't mean people won't get there and people won't click on that button.
It's another great point. I never thought that I'd really want something I made to be super sticky, but it's great that story maps are. Let's see. How is SEO for specific story maps? Do they often show up in search results?
They do. Early on in our tenure, we didn't pay much attention to SEO. Fortunately, now our developers and colleagues in ArcGIS Online and elsewhere have paid a good bit of attention. And now I find almost always the fastest way, when I'm looking for a specific story, I'll type a description or the what I remember the title of the story and add story maps at the end. And almost always it comes up very at the top or very close to the top of just a typical Google search. So, so yeah, SEO is seems to be working quite well for ArcGIS StoryMaps.
Great, thanks, Alan. So at this point, I'd love to call your attention to the chat. Ross just sent a message in it, and that's the chat, not the general Q&A. There is a survey, and it will give us more information on how we can keep improving ArcGIS story maps. So please go ahead and click that link and make sure you fill it out soon after this webinar. We will make sure that this webinar is available by the end of the week on our YouTube channel. And I saw that in the chat, there's also a request for the questions and answers and the links that were shared. We'll also collect the chat and the links and put together like a brief frequently asked questions story for you all to access, and include the links to my demo and Ross's demo story if he wants to as well. And so with that, I think we have maybe time for a couple of more questions, and then I'll hand it over to Dan and Alan to close us out. So we have a question here. If you could only afford a license for 1 year, when your license expires, will the collection be gone, or will they continue to exist and you just wouldn't be able to update or change them? So that is a great question. Alan, and correct me if I'm wrong here, but I don't believe that your stories or collections will go away once you don't have a license anymore. We also have a free version of stories, so if your account is just bumped back down to that free version, they'll continue to exist, right, Alan?
I confess I'm a little vague on the details there. I know your story lasts for some period of time after your account expires, but I'm not sure. Ross, do you know? If not, we can get back to you later on that.
Back. So it depends is the answer, which is a little bit vague. But so if you are part of an organization, say you are part of Smithsonian and you work there and then you leave Smithsonian, you know, what happens to your stories that you authored in your account? Now, in that scenario, what happens is, you know, Dan Cole, who administers the accounts, he will take your items that you've created and he will transfer ownership, so that your amazing work creating stories, creating collections won't just disappear, right? And so if you aren't within an organization and have a year-long license, you know, there's some things you can do. So one is, you know, you can always transfer your content to another organization if you know, have a personal one and then go to work for an organization, or you are part of a nonprofit. I would consider, you know, creating a public account because it doesn't cost anything and you can create stories in that today. Lots of functionality there. So if you are an individual user, there's kind of different things that different options you have. Or if you're in an organization, you have different options you can have. So that's why I preface this with it depends.
Yeah, this is a good chance also to mention Esri's nonprofit program for those of you who might be from organizations outside the Smithsonian that are not profits. Esri has a very robust program that offers deep discounts to nonprofit organizations, and you can get details at esri.com/nonprofit. There's a simple form that allows you to sign up, and it essentially just covers some hosting costs, and the rest is essentially free. So hundreds of nonprofit organizations are taking advantage of that program.
And you also have a great program for schools too.
Yes. Yeah, and any school in the country, in fact, worldwide these days, any K through 12 school in the country that wants to, that requests an account can get an ArcGIS online account, including StoryMaps, free of charge.
Yeah, that's a incredible thing to call out, Kathy and Alan. It's one of my favorite things about Esri and ArcGIS StoryMaps is the fact that a lot of times StoryMaps is available at a really discounted cost or low to no cost. With that, I think we've wrapped up just about the time we have for the Q&A section. So I'm going to hand it back over to Alan and Dan to close us out. Thank you, everyone.
Great. Well, thank you so much for joining us today. It's a real thrill. It's been so exciting to see Smithsonian and other like institutions kind of jump on board, or at least express lots of interest in jumping on board. We're here to help and assist. And please do let us know if you have questions, concerns, comments, etc. Dan?
And anybody who, from the Smithsonian that is, anybody who wants an ArcGIS online account, which is pretty much needed for your creating a story map, contact me and I'll create an account for you.
Great. It's been a real pleasure working with Dan. He's been a real champion for us, and we're grateful to that. And again, thank you so much for joining us, everybody.